Welcome back to the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Chase. What we're going to be talking about in today's episode is nothing less than historic. This is the first time since starting this podcast 18 months ago that I've had to stop everything that I'm doing in order to cover a piece of breaking news that has sweeping and profound implications for disclosure. So here's what happened. On Monday, June 5th, 2023, a story was published by The Debrief, presenting claims from the first whistleblower to step forward publicly since the passing of UAP whistleblower legislation a few months ago. This whistleblower, David Charles Rusch, is a high-level member of the intelligence community, and he is claiming to have knowledge of special access programs that have recovered non-human technological craft. Later that same day, an excerpt from an interview with the whistleblower conducted by investigative journalist Coulthart was aired on NewsNation, in which Rusch made even more shocking claims. And all of this is leading up to a full version of the interview to be aired this Sunday, June 11th at 9 p.m. on NewsNation. So just know that as shocking as everything that we're about to discuss is going to sound, this is still a developing story, and we'll get to all of that in a moment. But before we begin, I just want to say this. There is a lot of material to cover here. The journalistic team that put it all together did an exemplary job of providing as much context and corroborating evidence to support their claims as possible. As a result, the article itself is dense. And even then, there's only so much that you can include in one article. And I think it's really important, for reasons that we'll get to put this story in the context of everything that has happened thus far with disclosure. I've spent the last 3 days pulling it all apart and doing my best to present all of this in as clear a manner as possible so that it's easy to grok not just what this groundbreaking article says, but how we got here and what it all might mean. If you've been following this story from the beginning and you already have all that background, that's fantastic. You may not need some of what's covered here. But either way, I hope that it can be a resource that you can share with others in your life who haven't spent the last few years obsessing over this stuff and might need a little extra framing to understand the significance of what's going on here. For reasons that we'll get to later on in the episode, we need to do everything that we can to get this story in front of as many people as possible. Also, know that I will do my best to include as many resources and as much background information I can in the episode brief so that you can dive more deeply into anything that we discuss here today. So let's dive into it. What makes this story so significant? It comes down to two things: what is being said and who is saying it. So let's actually start with the latter. This article in The Debrief was written by well-respected investigative journalists Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal. Kean and Blumenthal were the team behind the 2017 article in the New York Times that marked a watershed moment in the conversation about UFOs, and frankly is the reason why there's been an influx of new people taking interest in this topic since. I include myself in that cohort. The 2017 New York Times article titled "Glowing Auras and Black Money: The Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program" revealed the existence of a secretive Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP, that investigated reports of unidentified flying objects. The article featured accounts from military personnel, including interviews with Luis Elizondo, a former military intelligence official who managed the program. Elizondo claimed that ATIP had encountered unexplained sightings by military pilots, indicating the presence of advanced, unidentified aerial phenomena that defied conventional explanations, and he expressed concerns about the potential national security implications of these encounters. In fact, he was so concerned with this situation that in October of 2017, he resigned from his position in protest and dedicated his life to pursuing greater transparency on the UFO issue. Beyond being the team to break this incredible story in the pages of the New York Times, Kean and Blumenthal both have impressive journalistic resumes. Leslie Kean is an investigative journalist and author known for her decades of tireless work on the subject of UFOs. She is the author of the book UFOs: Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record, which compiles testimony from high-ranking military and government personnel regarding their encounters with UAP. The 2023 National Geographic documentary series, UFOs Investigating the Unknown, was inspired by her work. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. not just for its content on UFOs, which is excellent, but because it tells the story of the decades of work that Leslie and her colleagues have put into dragging this story into the light. As celebrated as Leslie is, I don't think that many, even in the UFO community, have a true sense of the scale of the contributions that she's made to this topic, and it's worth taking the time to hear that story. Her partner in this, Ralph Blumenthal, has an impressive resume of his own. He is an accomplished journalist and author who had a career spanning nearly 4 decades at the New York Times. Blumenthal also received a Pulitzer Prize for leading the Times Metro team in their breaking news coverage of the 1993 truck bombing of the World Trade Center. And not only are these journalists highly credible, but the whistleblower that has come forward has quite an impressive pedigree as well, which we'll get to in just a moment. He is well placed to have access to the kinds of information that he claims to have, and he's already given hours of testimony to both Congress and the intelligence community inspector general. And multiple high-level intelligence officials have stepped forward to attest to Grusch's character and to corroborate his claims. But beyond just the credibility of the people doing the reporting, this story is significant because of what is being said. We're going to get into the specifics here in just a moment, but as earth-shattering and profound as the revelations are that we are potentially not alone on this planet, and that our government may be in possession of non-human technology, when you dive into what David Grusch is really saying, he's painting a picture of a much larger pattern of secrets that have the potential to call literally everything into question, from the history of the 20th century to our place both in the cosmos and in the food chain. One more thing before we begin. I think it's important to state that the reason that this story appeared in the Debrief, which is a fantastic and reputable news organization, but admittedly a smaller one, is because the mainstream media passed on this story. The New York Times said no. The Hill said no. Politico said no. In a June 8th article in Vanity Fair, Kane and Blumenthal have clarified that the Washington Post didn't technically say no, but that they weren't able to move quickly enough in vetting the story and they had to move forward without them. Blumenthal told Vanity Fair that circumstances, including that Grusch's identity as the whistleblower had been leaked out on the internet, pushed them to publish sooner than they'd hoped. Blumenthal was quoted as saying, "If there had been no leaks, it might have been different. But people on the internet were spreading stories. David Grusch was getting harassing phone calls, and we felt the only way to protect him was to get the story out." As Ross Coulthart mentioned in the most recent episode of his podcast with Bryce Zabel, Need to Know, a hard truth of journalism is that things rarely go well for whistleblowers. One of the primary motivations for a whistleblower to go public in the first place with what they know is for protection. The reality of the dangers faced by whistleblowers who come forward with a story of this magnitude can't be overstated. And you can't understand the full scope of how this story came to be and what it might mean without taking the time to look at it through that lens. This also ought to serve as a wake-up call to members of the UFO community who have been engaging in leaking information, as well as amplifying leaked information by reposting it over the last few weeks. Whether motivated by ego, naivete about the seriousness of the situation, or a genuine desire to do a public service, these actions aren't just woefully misguided and counterproductive, they're dangerous. They endanger the life and livelihood of whistleblowers who are putting everything on the line in the name of doing the right thing. Whistleblowers deserve our gratitude, our support, and our protection, all of which are best achieved with our discretion. In the meantime, the mainstream media, from Vice to New York Magazine to The Guardian, has slowly begun to pick this story up over the last few days, which is encouraging. But I think it's important to note that all that they've done is summarize the article as it was reported. Thus far, we have yet to see any legitimate follow-up or investigation from any major news outlet on these allegations. I hope that within a few days this will no longer be the case. The silence of the legacy media on this matter is as shocking as it is unacceptable. And on that note, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Micah Hanks, Lieutenant Tim McMillan, and the whole team over at the Debrief for their bravery and service in publishing this article. The American people owe you a debt of gratitude. So before we dive into the story, I think it's important to get a little background on how we got here. This whistleblower didn't just appear out of nowhere. This was the result of years of work that kicked off with the publishing of the 2017 New York Times article. That article created a firestorm in Washington and resulted in a lot of problems for Elizondo himself. He had already walked away from his career and his pension when he resigned from his position in protest. The sacrifice of a family man deciding to make that move because he believed it was the right thing to do is hard to fully convey, but that ended up being the least of his worries. According to Elizondo, the Pentagon illegally deleted some of his files in order to make it appear that he had never worked as a member of ATIP. What appeared to be a pretty clear campaign was launched to discredit him personally and professionally in retaliation for coming forward. And while none of this has been proven yet, it's important to note that the Inspector General has taken these claims very seriously and has launched an investigation into the matter. Beyond just the potential retaliation that whistleblowers face, as well as the potential loss of their livelihood and pensions, there was another very real problem. There was no clear method of reporting anything to do with UAPs and no clear place to report it. After the shuttering of ATIP, there technically wasn't anyone investigating those things. So even if you could find someone to tell, there was no real mechanism or funding or staff for anyone to investigate those claims further. So why would you take that risk with your career and your ability to feed your family when you know that running this information up the flagpole won't result in anything but problems for you? To drag UAP secrecy into the light, Elizondo and his colleagues needed other whistleblowers to step forward and share what they knew. And they had their work cut out for them. They not only had to make it safe for whistleblowers to come forward, which would involve getting the collective, bipartisan will of a highly partisan Congress behind them, but they had to get the resources, expertise, and authority needed for someone to actually act on this information, which would also take an act of Congress. Elizondo and many other Washington insiders got to work on this. They spent years talking to Congress, raising awareness on this issue, helping to draft legislation, etc., in order to put all of the pieces in place in order to make this happen. Everything about this bombshell whistleblower story wouldn't be possible without their tireless efforts. By 2020, the pressure from Congress to take this national security threat seriously reached a crescendo. On August 4th, 2020, Deputy Defense Secretary David Norquist announced the creation of the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force. The mission of the task force was to detect, analyze, and catalog UAPs that could potentially pose a threat to U.S. national security. The following summer, on June 25th, 2021, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a report on UAPs. The report found that the UAP task force was unable to identify 143 of 144 objects spotted between 2004 and 2021. The report also said that 18 of these objects featured unusual movement patterns or flight characteristics, and more analysis was needed to determine if those sightings represented breakthrough technology. The report noted that some of these steps were resource-intensive and required additional investment. The UAP task force continued their work until July 2022, when it was announced that it would be replaced with a new office within the United States Office of the Secretary of Defense called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or ARO. We owe the creation of ARO to the Gillibrand Amendment, which passed as a part of the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act. As the name implies, this new office was looking for anomalous objects, not just in the sky, but in all domains. This means in the air, in the sea, on the land, and even in space. This created one single clearinghouse for all reports of unidentified objects. ARO was tasked with continuing the investigation begun by the UAP task force. They were put in charge of investigating, reporting, and sharing all UAP data. Specifically, they were tasked with providing an annual report to Congress summarizing all of their findings. This report was required to be delivered in a non-classified format, but it was allowed to have a classified annex. So basically, there's the non-classified version of the report that can be shared with the public, but classified information pertaining to the report could be shared with Congress privately. They also were charged with creating procedures for military and civilian personnel working in any capacity for the DoD or the intelligence community to report incidents or information about UAPs, including adverse physiological effects associated with UAPs. And as a side note, if you haven't looked at the actual legislation as it's written, it's worth taking the time. We may not know what classified information is being shared with Congress, but when words like adverse physiological effects are included in the legislation, you can get a hint about the kinds of reports that they've been privy to. The creation of AARO was groundbreaking, but we still had a fundamental problem. We had indications for years that there are various elements within the Pentagon that have been intentionally withholding information about UAPs. I don't want to get totally sidetracked with this discussion right now, but just consider the fact that the initial 3 leaked videos of UFOs that were featured in the 2017 New York Times article, and all of the military pilots that stepped forward to talk about their encounters were from the Navy. And the UAP task force was initially set up under Navy intelligence. So the obvious question becomes, where is the Air Force in all of this? Their very conspicuous silence is hard to ignore, and it gives you a sense of what we might be dealing with here. So, a major problem was that AARO didn't have a good way to make any of the various branches of the military intelligence apparatus share their data on UAPs. There was no real mechanism for AARO to either find those programs or to make them share their information. So the only hope became that individuals within those special access programs might be willing to come forward and share what they knew. But as we've already discussed, that's a lot to ask of people. Being a whistleblower for highly classified programs could result in various forms of retaliation. People could be blacklisted, lose their security clearances, end up in jail, or worse. So there needed to be a way to ensure that whistleblowers could be protected from blowback as much as possible. That protection came in December 2022, when the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act was signed into law. In this legislation was language to protect whistleblowers who wanted to share what they knew about UAPs with Congress and with AARO, which is how it is that we are hearing about David Charles Grusch today. So who is David Grusch? David Grusch has quite an impressive resume when it comes to investigating UAPs. A decorated former combat officer who served in Afghanistan, Grusch has had a long career in intelligence. With over 14 years under his belt, Grusch's background is deeply rooted in advancing American security through covert and clandestine operations. Part of Grusch's intriguing career journey includes time at 2 key U.S. government agencies, the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, or the NGA, and the National Reconnaissance Office, or the NRO. The NGA focuses on providing geospatial intelligence for national security purposes, meaning they analyze and distribute all sorts of geographic information, including satellite imagery and maps. They support everything from military operations to disaster response. At the NGA, Grusch wore many hats. He served as a Senior Intelligence Capabilities Integration Officer, cleared at the top secret/secret compartmented information level, and was the agency's Senior Technical Advisor for UAP analysis/transmedium issues. From late 2021 to July 2022, he co-led the NGA's UAP analysis and represented the agency in the UAP task force. The National Reconnaissance Office, on the other hand, is all about reconnaissance satellites. Their mission is to gather critical intelligence information to support national security and defense objectives, working closely with other agencies and the Department of Defense to collect and analyze data from space-based systems. In Grusch's time at the NRO, he served as Senior Intelligence Officer from 2016 to 2021 and led the production of the NRO Director's daily briefing to the President. He held a civilian role that was equivalent in rank to a military colonel. He also acted as the NRO's representative to the UAP task force between 2019 and 2021. A big part of Grusch's role while working with the government involved briefing Congress on UAPs. He also contributed to drafting UAP-related language for the fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization Act that contained the very whistleblower protections that he later used to come forward about his story. Stick a pin in that because we're going to come back to it. So, in summation, Grusch was a high-level intelligence officer and investigator who was working at the intersection of several government agencies that had access to the pertinent data needed to meaningfully investigate UAPs. And as a member of the UAP task force, he was both privy to the ongoing investigations into UAPs and was tasked with regularly reporting those findings to Congress. Based on what he learned in those positions, on April 7, 2023, like Elizondo before him, Grusch decided to leave his government position to promote government accountability on the UAP issue through public awareness. So before we get into the specific allegations made by Grusch, let's look at who he's already talked to. It's important to note that Grusch didn't go directly to the media, but rather he has done all of this through the proper channels set up by the whistleblower legislation passed by the NDAA. In doing so, David Grusch has provided hours of testimony while under oath to Congress and the intelligence community inspector general. It's also important to note that the statements that he made to Congress included classified information which he has not made public. So what exactly has he said to Congress? In his testimony before Congress, David Grusch revealed classified information regarding covert programs that have been involved in the retrieval of craft of non-human origin. He emphasized that these recoveries have been taking place for decades, involving the government, its allies, and defense contractors. The analysis conducted on the retrieved objects has led to the conclusion that they are of exotic origin, possessing unique atomic arrangements, radiological signatures, and distinct vehicle morphologies. Grusch stressed that the material in question includes both intact and partially intact vehicles. Grusch further asserted that UFO legacy programs have been concealed within multiple agencies, hiding UAP activities under conventional secret access programs without proper reporting to oversight authorities. He informed Congress about a long-standing, publicly unknown Cold War centered around the recovery and exploitation of physical material from UAP crashes and landings. This competition with near-peer adversaries, which basically refers to anyone with a military that we would legitimately need to worry about, aimed to gain asymmetric national defense advantages through reverse engineering and exploitation. Grusch has provided Congress with hours of recorded classified information, transcribed into hundreds of pages, specifically detailing the materials recovery program. However, no physical materials related to the wreckage or non-human objects have been provided to Congress thus far. Grusch's investigation relied on extensive interviews with high-level intelligence officials, including those directly involved in the program. He emphasized that the operation had been shielded from proper congressional oversight, and he personally experienced targeting and harassment due to his investigation. Grusch highlighted that the craft recovery operations are ongoing at different levels of activity, and that he possesses knowledge of the individuals, both current and former, who are involved in these operations. According to him, individuals on these UAP programs approached him in his official capacity, expressing concerns about various wrongdoings, such as illegal contracting and the suppression of information across industrial and academic sectors. Associates who vouched for Grusch confirmed the sensitivity of his information and provided evidence that materials from objects of non-human origin are held by highly secretive black programs. While specific details regarding the locations and program names remain classified, the Inspector General and the Intelligence Committee staff were provided with this information. Additionally, several current members of the recovery program have corroborated Grusch's information in conversations with the Inspector General's office, supporting the claims made in his classified complaint. So something that may have jumped out at you while reviewing what Grusch has shared with Congress is that he's not saying that he's actually seen any direct evidence or even photos to corroborate the non-human craft allegedly in the possession of the secret crash retrieval program. This has led many to question Grusch's claims and to dismiss what he's saying as hearsay. And listen, I can see how people get there. But having spent the last several days doing a deep dive on this story, I'd like to offer an important perspective on this situation that seems to be getting lost in the noise. First of all, we need to recognize that Grusch's public statements were cleared by the DoD back in early April. And we need to be clear about what that means and what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that the DoD is saying that his statements are factually accurate or even that they approve of him saying it. It only means that they have cleared his statements insofar as they, 1, don't reveal classified information, and 2, don't put national security at risk. If Grusch didn't directly see the craft, then he isn't technically revealing classified information. It's hearsay. So, for the DoD to deny his request to make these public statements would have both acknowledged that the information was classified and that it was accurate. Otherwise, why is it classified? The same can be said of the national security risk. It was in the best interest of the DoD in this situation to approve his request and hope the story gets buried. It allows them to maintain plausible deniability. But what we also need to recognize here is that this means that someone who actually saw the physical evidence of the crash retrieval program could not do what Grusch is doing, at least not publicly. For someone to step forward on something like this and not immediately get the Edward Snowden treatment, they can't be revealing classified information to the public. Grusch's distance from the evidence allows him to say things that people within these programs can't without going directly to jail. So while I can't prove this, all of this looks to be intentional to me. In his role at the UAP task force, Grusch served as a liaison to Congress, providing them with regular reporting on the topic, and even helping to draft the language in the NDAA. I told you we'd come back to that. It seems very likely to me that Grusch was very aware of and was perhaps even involved in crafting the whistleblower legislation. And he's a savvy intelligence official who understands how all of this works. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that Grusch, knowing that the whistleblower legislation was coming, purposely did not view any direct evidence of the craft. Everyone involved in this effort and all of the intelligence officials that came to him behind the scenes with this information would have known that that was the only way that he could actually get away with going public with it. From where I'm sitting, it looks like the goal wasn't to provide disclosure with full evidence. That would not have been possible. There are literally no legal avenues to directly share classified information with the public. Instead, the goal was to create enough noise to trigger an investigation that might be able to get to the truth. And this is why I think it's so important to understand the full background of this story. Without that context, it's impossible to get a sense of the game that's actually being played here. The push for disclosure has been an elaborate game of 3D chess, played against the United States intelligence apparatus by some of its finest. These people know where the bodies are buried. They know how the system works. And what they've managed to accomplish in the last 5.5 years through sheer grit and determination is as inspiring as it is unprecedented. So getting back to the gobsmacking claims that Grusch has made both under oath in front of Congress and now publicly, the obvious next question is, how do we know that David Grusch is credible and is who he says he is? First of all, I have to say that the Debrief is doing an admirable job of providing transparency into how they vetted each and every claim in the article that they published. There is a 3-part series that they've released with investigative reporter Lieutenant Tim McMillan, who led the fact-checking effort that dives into all the details of how this was done. It's too much to cover here in this episode, but I'll link those in the episode brief so that you can take a look for yourself. Besides the extensive vetting that's been done by the journalists and the team at the Debrief, we also have high-level members of the intelligence community who have stepped forward to vouch for both Grusch and his claims. First, we have Carl E. Nell. Carl E. Nell is a recently retired Army colonel and current aerospace executive who was the Army's liaison for the UAP task force from 2021 to 2022 and worked with Grusch there. In the article in the Debrief, Nell characterizes Grusch as, quote, beyond reproach. And next we have Christopher Mellon. Chris Mellon, former Undersecretary of Defense and one of the insiders who worked most closely with Luis Elizondo in his efforts to drag this issue into the light, also chimed in to corroborate Grusch's claims. He said, quote, a number of well-placed current and former officials have shared detailed information with me regarding this alleged program, including insights into the history, governing documents, and the location where a craft was allegedly abandoned and recovered. However, it is a delicate matter getting this potentially explosive information into the right hands for validation. This is made harder by the fact that, rightly or wrongly, a number of potential sources do not trust the leadership of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office established by Congress. Perhaps most intriguing are the comments made in the article by a man identified as Jonathan Gray, which is apparently not his real name, but the name that he uses in his position. Gray is a generational officer of the United States intelligence community with a top-secret clearance who currently works for the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, or NASIC, where the analysis of UAPs has been his focus. It's important to note that NASIC, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, is the Department of Defense's primary Air Force source for foreign air and space threat analysis. Its mission is to discover and characterize air, space, missile, and cyber threats, according to the agency's website. In his comments, Gray said, quote, the existence of complex historical programs involving the coordinated retrieval and study of exotic materials dating back to the early 20th century should no longer remain a secret. The majority of retrieved foreign exotic materials have a prosaic terrestrial explanation and origin, but not all. and any number higher than 0 in this category represents an undeniably significant statistical percentage, end quote. He continued by saying, a vast array of our most sophisticated sensors, including space-based platforms, have been utilized by different agencies, typically in triplicate, to observe and accurately identify the out-of-the-world nature, performance, and design of these anomalous machines, which are then determined not to be of earthly origin. And more highly placed officials continue to come to Grusch's defense, speaking both to his integrity and calling for this matter to be taken seriously by Congress. In a show of support, Jim Schell, the former chief scientist for Air Force Space Command, now known as the U.S. Space Force, said in a recent LinkedIn post, quote, "I will vouch for the integrity of Dave Grusch." In his statement, Schell did not rule out Grusch's claims that materials of non-human origin are held by the U.S. government, its allies, and defense contractors. He added, quote, "Getting to the bottom of this is elusive and problematic, to say the least. I will assert no matter the conclusion of extraterrestrial materials or not, the DoD and IC security apparatus is in trouble, and unwitting accomplices are fostering an abusive system." Beyond these high-level officials corroborating his claims, we also have a hint that David Grusch is telling the truth in the fact that his claims have caused alleged retaliation against him that were well supported enough to have been taken seriously by the Intelligence Community Inspector General. In May 2022, Grusch, represented by his lawyer Charles McCulloch III, filed a significant complaint with the Intelligence Community Inspector General regarding classified information he'd compiled while working for the UAP task force since 2019. According to the released version of this complaint, Grusch claimed that certain factions within the intelligence community purposefully concealed UAP-related information from Congress, inhibiting legitimate oversight of the UAP program. Grusch had shared this classified data confidentially with the Department of Defense Inspector General back in July 2021. However, Grusch reported that his identity and his role in the testimony were revealed to individuals within the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, although he didn't accuse the Inspector General's office of inappropriate disclosure. Following this, Grusch experienced months of retaliation starting in 2021. While he requested that the specifics of these reprisals be kept under wraps to safeguard the ongoing investigation, his complaint was deemed, quote, credible and urgent by the Intelligence Community Inspector General in July 2022. McCulloch and his managing partner penned the complaint, which concluded with Grusch affirming, under the penalties of perjury, the veracity of the information provided. This led to the initiation of a whistleblower reprisal investigation, and Grusch commenced private discussions with congressional intelligence committees. So the question becomes, if there are forces within the DoD who are retaliating against Grusch, then what is their motivation for doing so? What would be the motivation of retaliating against a whistleblower unless there was ultimately some truth to what they were alleging? It's also worth pointing out that Grusch's lawyer, Charles McCulloch III, is quite an impressive figure himself. He's a senior partner at the Compass Rose Legal Group in Washington and was the inaugural Inspector General of the intelligence community, confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2011. Back then, he reported directly to James Clapper, the then Director of National Intelligence, supervising intelligence officers, conducting audits, inspections, and investigations. So the fact that he's taken on Grusch in this matter is definitely worth noting. As stunning as the allegations made by Grusch in the article in the Debrief are, in many ways they pale in comparison to what he divulged in his interview with investigative journalist Ross Coulthart. Coulthart is the author of the phenomenal book, In Plain Sight, An Investigation into UFOs and Impossible Science, which is one of the books that I recommend most to people new to the UFO topic. He's been at the forefront of investigating the UFO topic for years and is the co-host of the also phenomenal Need to Know podcast along with his co-host Bryce Sable. While the full version of the interview won't be released until Sunday, June 11th, an excerpt from that interview was aired on NewsNation this week, and the claims that Grusch makes are nothing short of staggering. Among the allegations made, Grusch claims that the UAP task force was intentionally refused access to a broad crash retrieval program. When asked by Coulthart to clarify what he meant by crash retrieval program, he said, quote, "These are retrieving non-human origin technical vehicles, call it spacecraft if you will, non-human exotic origin vehicles that have either landed or crashed." Ross then pushed for further clarification, asking, "We have spacecraft from another species?" To which Grusch replied, "We do, yeah." When asked how many, he replied, "Quite a number." In telling Coulthart about his discovery of the secret crash retrieval program, he said, quote, "I thought it was totally nuts, and I thought at first I was being deceived. It was a ruse. People started confiding in me. They approached me. I have plenty of current and former senior intelligence officers that came to me, many of which I knew almost my whole career, that confided in me that they were part of a program. They named the program. I'd never heard of it. And they told me, based on their oral testimony, that they provided me with documents and other proof that there was, in fact, a program that the UAP task force was not read into." He doubled down on this, saying, "There's a sophisticated disinformation campaign targeting the U.S. populace, which is extremely unethical and immoral." Based on what he saw in his time working as a member of the UAP task force, it's clear that the question of whether or not there is another advanced intelligence on this planet is no longer up for debate. "We're definitely not alone," he said. "Absolutely, the data points empirically that we are not alone." Coulthart asked him specifically whether or not he was privy to any evidence that we had recovered any bodies along with these craft. He replied, quote, "Well, naturally, when you've recovered something that's either landed or crashed, sometimes you encounter dead pilots. And believe it or not, and as fantastical as that sounds, it's true." And another stunning revelation was dropped in the teaser for Sunday's interview. In it, Grusch suggested that the cover-up involving UFOs doesn't go back 76 years to the summer of the Roswell crash, as is typically believed even within the UFO community, but 90 years. That places the origins of this story back in the early 1930s and calls into question nearly everything that we thought we knew about the history of the 20th century. I keep using words like profound and earth-shattering to describe the claims that Grusch is making because it's truly impossible to overstate the significance of what is being alleged. Like everyone else, I'll be waiting on pins and needles to watch that interview on Sunday, and I'm sure I'll offer more thoughts after I've had the chance to process that. But without seeing the whole thing, there are a few things that are worth noting now. First of all, Ross Coulthart has said that this was a 7-hour interview. Obviously, what we see on Sunday will only be a small portion of the entire interview that was done. It'll be interesting to see what makes the final cut. Coulthart said on this week's episode of Need to Know that there's information that he learned in that interview that he's keeping back out of respect for national security concerns. Ominously, he also claimed that what he knows about this situation scares him. It's also interesting to note that he has gone several steps further than Kane and Blumenthal went in their article, perhaps most notably in his claims that we haven't just recovered craft, but bodies. Kane and Blumenthal have since made it clear that this was an intentional choice on their part. They did not talk to Grusch about bodies, and in follow-up interviews this week, they have thus far declined to speak on that matter. As for why they made that choice, we can only speculate for now. But my guess would be that they were attempting to get the most important points on the record without going too far and either alienating their sources within the government or alienating the public by pushing them further on this topic than they were willing to go. Like I said, that's just my guess. We can't know for sure, but as frustrating as that approach may seem to many, I think we have to give Kane and Blumenthal a lot of credit for the restraint that they have shown over the years. Consistently, the most progress has been made thus far by people who are willing to show that kind of discretion, who are willing to check their egos in order to put another point on the board for disclosure. I want to be clear that none of that is a judgment on Coulthart or anyone else who pushed whistleblowers for all the information that they have. There is a place for that as well, and trust that I will be watching and reporting back to you on all of it. But it's important to recognize that these moments are only made possible because of the sacrifices that came before. So I think we should be slow to cast judgment on Kane and Blumenthal for being more cautious in their approach. However, as unbelievable and historic and profound and controversial as the claims about craft and bodies are, I'd argue that those revelations aren't actually the real headline here. This is not to minimize the profound significance that non-human craft and bodies represent. Getting confirmation that human beings aren't alone on this planet, that other intelligent species exist, and that they have technology beyond anything that we have in our arsenal is a paradigm shift, at least on the magnitude of our recognition that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. You could argue that it's even bigger than that. If we get actual confirmation that that's the case, it is likely that the history books of the future will point to this as a new era in human history. This revelation will create a distinct before and after in the story of humanity. And the implications of this really can't be overstated. What does it mean for us to not be the most advanced species on our planet? What does this mean about the history of our species and who we are? What does this mean about the nature of our reality? And what does national security even mean against a potential adversary that is potentially thousands of years ahead of us in technological development? I don't know, but we shouldn't let our discomfort with the possible answer allow us to sugarcoat the reality of this situation. It's entirely possible to be excited about the possibilities while also realizing in a cold and sober way that this probably isn't great news for us. Just looking at our own history, when a more technological civilization comes into contact with a less technological civilization, the results are usually pretty devastating for the less technological civilization. I think it's also important to note that the recovered non-human vehicles have been described multiple times as having crashed or landed. That such an advanced craft would crash is strange enough. But to have one land, be abandoned, and then be recovered by humans stretches the limits of credulity. And it begs the question of whether or not we may have been given this technology on purpose, which led to an intense secret Cold War between superpower nations. It's hard to imagine an altruistic reason for doing that. But let's put all of that aside for a minute, because I'd argue that if what Grusch is saying is true, we have a much more urgent problem on our hands. What Grusch is specifically alleging here is that, in his own words, there's a sophisticated disinformation campaign targeting the U.S. populace, which is extremely unethical and immoral. And the upcoming previews of the interview seem to suggest that this goes back to at least the early 1930s. The implications of this are sweeping, profound, and frankly, terrifying. First of all, in a democratic republic, which is what the United States alleges itself to be, and what it was designed to be by our forefathers who wrote the Constitution, the power is vested in the people who elect leaders to carry out their will. For that to work, the government needs to be accountable to the people and to the Constitution. If the government is running a decades-long psyop against the American people, that is illegal, immoral, unethical, and unconstitutional. Depending on the details, it could rise to the level of treason. And the challenge that this presents is twofold. First of all, if this is true, we'll have to deal with unraveling the fact that this has happened at a breathtaking scale and for nearly a century, which will be an absolute mess. But we also have to deal with the fact that the very people that we need to come forward on this are likely highly disincentivized from doing so. If this is true, people can go to jail for this. So we're going to have to figure out where the line is between holding people to account for high crimes against the American people while also providing some kind of a pathway forward for this information to actually come out. I don't think anyone has a good answer for how we will handle that. And before we can begin to deal with the potential reality of a highly advanced non-human presence on this planet, we're going to have to start by getting our own house in order. But I'd argue that even that isn't the biggest challenge that we face if these allegations are true. The clear implications of what Grusch is suggesting here is that there are one or more factions operating within the United States military intelligence apparatus that are working above the oversight of Congress, above the oversight of the Oval Office, and above the oversight of the very office that was created by the elected representatives of this nation in order to consolidate and carry out our investigation of UAPs. This suggests that there is potentially a rogue element within the government that is working above the Constitution. If that's true, it's both the greatest threat to our democracy that we've ever known and this country's biggest scandal. Forget Watergate and the Kennedy assassination and all of the rest of it. There is no story bigger than this one. And it gets worse, because if this is true, then this rogue element within the government has in its possession highly advanced non-human technology. And it sounds likely that, for almost a century now, this group has been appropriating taxpayer funds to develop this technology, which it has gone through great lengths to keep from the American people. That is not great news for us. Now, we absolutely shouldn't jump to conclusions or immediately surrender to conspiracy theories about a shadow government. Even if what Grusch is describing is the case, the motivations for this secrecy might not be entirely sinister. If we have, in fact, been engaged in a decades-long secret Cold War, as he claims, there could be multiple very legitimate national security reasons for keeping this information classified even above the office of the president. But if what Grusch is describing is really the case, regardless of the motivations, we find ourselves in a very precarious situation. If you allow a group of people to operate without constitutional oversight, and you allow this group to accumulate significant resources and highly advanced technology, it's not hard to imagine scenarios where we could easily lose control of our country, if we haven't already. This state of affairs would also mean that we don't know our own history. If various superpowers began to retrieve highly advanced, non-human technology as far back as the early 1930s, then it calls the entire history of the 20th century into question. What was World War II really about? What was the Cold War really about? How much of what we've been told about world events have been true, and how much has been an elaborate ruse to cover up the biggest mystery and perhaps the biggest threat that humanity has ever faced? And will we ever be told the truth? A lot of that depends on what happens next. Now, granted, I'm not saying that I necessarily believe that all of the allegations made by Rusch are true. There is a lot more work that needs to be done to get to the bottom of this story. But what I'm arguing is that these allegations are credible. They come from someone with an impressive intelligence pedigree who would have access to the information that he claims to have. He's been heavily vetted by some of the best journalists working in the field and has the backing of multiple high-level intelligence colleagues who are willing to vouch for both the strength of his character and the veracity of his claims. What is called for here is further investigation, and it's going to take the full weight of both our elected officials and the legacy media rigorously pursuing the truth if we're going to make any progress here. As for the Pentagon, this has been their only comment on this story thus far via DoD spokesperson Susan Go. Quote, "To date, AARO has not discovered any verifiable information to substantiate claims that any programs regarding the possession or reverse engineering of extraterrestrial materials have existed in the past or exist currently. AARO is committed to following the data and its investigation wherever it leads. AARO, working with the Office of the General Counsel and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, has established a safe and secure process for individuals to come forward with information to aid AARO in its congressionally mandated historical review. AARO's historical review of records and testimonies is ongoing and due to Congress by June 2024. AARO welcomes the opportunity to speak with any former or current government employer or contractor who believes that they have information relevant to the historical review." And in this statement, we can see exactly what we're up against in terms of getting the DoD to cop to any of this. This statement is misleading to the point of being meaningless and typifies the sleight of hand techniques traditionally used by the Pentagon to sidestep narratives that they wish to discredit without directly engaging. Grusch's point is that the UAP task force and now AARO, the very organizations that we put in place to investigate UAPs, have not been read into special access programs involving the recovery of non-human technology. So saying that AARO has not discovered any verifiable information to substantiate claims about reverse engineering of extraterrestrial materials, it's largely irrelevant to the claims that are being made. The Pentagon has chosen to answer a question, but entirely sidestepped the question. So what can we do? It's pretty clear from this statement that the DoD just hopes that this story will die. They're hoping that you won't really be paying attention. They're hoping that you won't bother to talk to your family and friends. They're hoping that you won't call your elected officials and demand that Congress investigate these claims further. And they're hoping that the mainstream media will continue to be asleep at the wheel on what is potentially the single biggest news story in the history of this country, if not the world. So the best thing that we can do right now is make as much noise about this as possible. Get on the phone to your representatives in Congress. Write letters to the editor of your local newspapers. Support outlets like the Debrief and NewsNation that are courageously taking on this story, and call out the larger outlets that refuse to engage. Talk to your family and friends. Send them this episode if you think it will help. Just don't be quiet, and don't let this story get buried. We may never have a chance like this again to get to the truth of the UFO phenomenon. We can't waste it.